now. And in order to make that point, I'd like to go back into history. Again, the statute that needs to be fixed is this 1887 statute called the Electoral Count Act. And it was enacted in 1887 in the wake of the disputed election of 1876. So that was a decade earlier. It took Congress 10 years to adopt a legislative remedy, despite the urgency that was recognized then. That was very risky for reasons that I'll explain, and we don't want to roll the dice again in the same way, and that's why we have to fix this statute now and not wait till after 2024. So kind of to set the stage for this point, many historians and political scientists, election law scholars think that we are living right now in a period of intense political polarization, not unlike the so-called Gilded Age of the 19th century in the aftermath of Reconstruction. That was a period also of intense polarization, and the disputed election of 1876 and the political conditions at the time resemble, unfortunately, what we're living through now. Most of us, grew up in the middle of the 20th century, blessed with low polarization, kind of a period of American history in terms of political contestation that was anomalous relative to the kind of contestation that we now have again. And it's dangerous to go back to those 19th century conditions. The thing that I am worried about, all of you all remember your SAT analogies, this is to that, like so and such is to such and such. I'm really worried that the relationship of 1872 to 1876 is analogous to what we just went through last time with 2020 and what we could face in 2024. What do I mean by that? Peter already talked a little bit about 1872, Horace Greeley died, but there were other disputes that were going on then, because as Reconstruction was ending, there was huge political contestation in some of the southern states like Arkansas and Louisiana, to the point where Congress disqualified electoral votes from those two states. It didn't really matter because Ulysses Grant won a landslide, but that election in and of itself showed the ambiguities and flaws in the constitutional structure for counting electoral votes. The 12th Amendment, which is the relevant constitutional law, is very vague and ambiguous. It just says states will send electoral votes to the president of the Senate and they shall be counted using the passive voice that my 6th grade English teacher said never to use if you want to be clear, but our Constitution does that. And so any clarity has to be supplied by statute. Congress, and this is to the point about the urgency of the situation and the difficulty of the congressional hurdle and why it's so important to get Congress to act. Congress debated between 1872 and 1876 on what a statutory reform should look like. I mean, they knew the need for it, and they didn't just ignore it, but given bicameralism, given polarization, they could not get a statutory fix across the finish line before the major disputed election of 1876. And that was, our minds are seared by the violence in the Capitol of our January 6, 2021, that was awful. But from a governance point of view and a constitutional stability point of view, our experience was actually less dangerous than what happened in 1876. And this is why Peter's slides are so important and so relevant. I'm not going to go into all the details of just how precarious the fight between Hayes and Tilden over the 1876 election was, except to say that it was the members of Congress that drew their pistols when they were counting electoral votes. And the Speaker of the House had to call the sergeant in arms out against members of Congress, not just people who were, citizens who were protesting. And we almost had a second civil war over the outcome of the election. Again, we could discuss it in Q&A, how it got resolved, but after the crisis of 1876, having failed to adopt the statute ahead of time, Congress said, well, we've got to have the statute. It's really apparent we can never go through this again. And yet they went through 1880 again without a statute. They went through 1884 again. And it was only when they were coming up against the 1888 election that they said, we cannot roll the dice again. And 1880 and 1884 were quite close. Fortunately, it didn't spin out of control. But every time you go into a presidential election without a good statute, you are risking huge constitutional calamity. And so that's the kind of risk that we are facing now if we don't repair the statute. The other point that's useful, I think, from a historical perspective, why do we have such a bad statute at the moment that needs the kind of repairs that Rick was talking about? It's because when they finally got around to adopting the 1887 statute, that was the best that they could do. They knew it was ambiguous. They knew it was not perfect. A political scientist at that time said it was gobbledygook and he didn't understand it. Kind of true, but they thought, well, something is better than nothing. And maybe that is true, but they were hoping that some future Congress before the next emergency occurred would provide the kind of clarity that Rick is talking about, so that they wouldn't leave these holes and these ambiguities that we are confronted with.